Great, good afternoon and good morning to everyone. My name is Carrie Shelton and I'm Body-worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Project Manager for BJA's Body-worn Camera Policy and Implementation Program. This next session, we will cover procuring your equipment and what are the federal requirements. And David Lewis from BJA, who is our lead for body-worn cameras and a senior policy advisor, is going to walk us through this presentation. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate that. Just wanted to thank you for being here on day 4. Also extend a welcome from our administration, Acting Director Michael Costigan, Deputy Director Silas Darden and Kristen Mahoney, and Associate Deputy Director Cornelia Sigworth, who all oversee this program. Next slide, please. As I said, Carrie mentioned, my name is Dave Lewis. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor from the Policy section of the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And joining me today is Raul Vasquez, who's one of our leads from the program side. Next slide. The very first thing we want to talk about here is when we talk about procurement. And the issue that we're dealing with here is under the procurement process, this is a competition of where you're getting service providers to provide the cameras and particular services that you might need for the deployment and implementation of your program. So it's extremely important that what you're doing in a procurement process, whether it's request for proposal or all these things, is that it has to be done in a very open and practical manner and that it's fair competition. What you have to be concerned about or watch for is sometimes if you make your specifications, although you know exactly what your department may or may not want, you have to make sure that it's not too restrictive, that it doesn't allow for other service providers that have similar or comparable products to be able to make application for this competition. So the other thing that's extremely important is that you need to follow particular guidelines. Now, these guidelines might be if you're from a local city, it might be from a county, or it may be from a state. You need to make sure and have a very working knowledge of what guidelines you can do in making procurements. A lot of times, departments do have procurement officers, especially for middle-sized to larger departments. But in the smaller departments, sometimes this becomes a little more difficult. The other thing that we have seen that has happened over the last few years is that there have been professional organizations that have gone out and got their own procurement contract to provide body-worn cameras for those that want to be part of that particular project. Now, this becomes unique in some ways because you're not actually doing the procurement from your own community, but you might be doing it through this third-party procurement contract. So it's very important to know what the requirements are, what the restrictions are. In some cases, and we've had this happen just over the last year, where the procurement was a professional organization, the procurement contract was in another state than the state that wanted to be part of that contract. So we have some responsibilities here as part of the Bureau of Justice Assistance in documenting that. So our programs people, Geraldo and Yolaine, they may have to reach out to you and say, okay, if you want to be part of this particular procurement contract, you need to take a look to see that that contract meets the guidelines for your local or state procurement process. So also that we may ask for documentation, not only of the procurement contract that you want to be part of, but also what the guidelines state in your particular jurisdiction. So all these things need to be taken into consideration when you're procuring your body-worn cameras. The last point I'd make on this particular slide is timeline. Now, the agency timeline is not a factor in compliance. As we talked in our last session, we talked about how long it would take. We would like for to submit your policy, but some of them take longer to do. Unfortunately, you can't procure certain items only because your funds are held until this policy approval process. And you won't have access to 90% of your fund. So those are the kind of things that need to be taken into consideration. What we want to do is assist you in whatever way we can to help you get those body-worn cameras purchased at your department and implemented. Now, what you may have to do sometimes is go out there and get bids or requests for proposals out there prior to having the availability of your funds to make the procurement. And those are all things that we can help you with. We have our people here in the programs office, myself in the policy office. We also have our TTA provider and the subject matter experts that all these people are here to help you with this progress. And one of the things that we talk about so many times is not reinventing the wheel. So okay, if we can assist you and provide you with guidance, maybe have you talk to departments of similar size that, or maybe in the same state, that could help you in this procurement process, those are things that we can do to help you out. This time I'd like to turn it over to Geraldo. Next slide, please.
You need to avoid unnecessary restrictions on competition. Unreasonable requirements in order to qualify for competition, unnecessary experience or excessive bonding, engaging in practices between firms or in non-competitive contracts with consultants on retainer, staff conflicts of interest, stock ownerships, specifying a brand name product without providing for an equivalent product be offered, and without performance requirements or features being clearly described, or any arbitrary action in the procurement process. I do want to bring one comment up is that you have to complete all your special conditions before you start a procurement process. There have been some times when some grantees have started, and then we have to do a retroactive approval. So please make sure to complete a procurement process after all your special conditions are done. Next slide, please. Procurement thresholds. Small purchase procedures are relatively simple and informal procurement methods for securing services, supplies, or other property that do not cost more than the simplified acquisition threshold, and it's currently set at $250,000. For purchases above the threshold, competitive sealed bidding is recognized as the preferred method of procurement. Micro purchase threshold is now at $10,000. The non-federal entity should consider the most economical approach to the acquisition. Next slide, please. Sole source. Exceptions to the prime rule of competition. These exceptions result in sole source or non-competitive contracting. The administrative rules are quite clear regarding the necessity to have open and free competition to satisfy grantee contractual requirements. Grantees may make the initial determination that competition is not feasible if one of the following circumstances exists. One, the item of service is available only from one single source. Two, the public exigency emergency for the requirement will not permit a delay resulting from a competitive solicitation. And three, after solicitation of a number of sources, competition is considered inadequate. Non-competitive proposals that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000 must be approved by BJA. Next slide. Procurement documentation. Monitoring your documentation. It is crucial that you maintain all procurement-related documentation for BJA review. Regardless of the need for approval, all procurement decisions should be documented and evidence maintained for review. What was sent out was received, how the decision was made, etc. Match requirements. Treat it as the same as federal funds. All documentation should be maintained. Federal procurement rules also apply. Next slide. David, I'll pass back to you.
Okay, thank you, Geraldo. One of the things I had mentioned briefly before is this resource to help you with your procurement. And like I had mentioned, that BJA realizes this is a very large program. It's getting a lot of exposure now, especially with some of these reforms being proposed in law enforcement, and the role that body-worn cameras are going to play in the communities dealing with use of force and officer safety and community safety. So what we want to do is some of the things that we could help you. I mentioned about not reinventing the wheel. One of the very first things that was designed was a body-worn camera toolkit. Now this is recently, it's just the new version has been released today. It's on the Bureau of Justice Assistance website. We'll make this the new URL available. You can actually use the old one and it'll take you to this new site. What we've actually done is try to make it a little more user-friendly, providing much more access to documents and things that are being done by other departments. So these are all things that help you make your decisions when you're talking about the procurement process, looking at what technologies are out there and what things that you may want to do as part of your body-worn camera program. Our technical assistance provider, CNA, they have a series of body-worn camera podcasts that just go through and address a lot of very interesting subjects. And these subjects that we identify are a lot of ones that are coming up from what the field is telling us, things that are of our interest. We just recently had a part 1 dealing with protests and use of body-worn cameras. We'll be having a part 2 coming up shortly. We also had one dealing on size of departments and use of body-worn cameras. So there are a lot of different ones out there. You also have the ability to look at this podcast series on the website. So you can go back and look at them. If it's a subject you're interested, you can go in and replay them. So it's very helpful. This next one, item number 3, in 2016, our sister agency, the National Institute of Justice, did a market survey out there looking at and identifying products by name, what they can do, use of different items, usability. So those are all the things that are out there. I actually have a slide that'll show a little bit about this market survey and the link to it. This next one, talking about body-worn camera training and technical assistance in general. As I mentioned, CNA is our training and technical assistance advisor. They have amazing knowledge on working with the field. They've been working with us since 2015. They also have, as part of their cadre, is subject matter experts. And subject matter experts are individuals that are from the field that are well-versed in body-worn camera issues, problems, developing policy, and all those different items that are of interest. I urge you, if you haven't reached out for anything out of our TTA provider or looking for something in the future, have a question on something, I urge that you use that particular this particular element for your program. Now we do have a generic RFP, request for proposal, that's you can pretty much fill in the blanks, put out there, because here's you're requesting certain information. There are certain things that our people, our subject matter experts, have worked over the years to say, yes, this should be in an RFP. This shouldn't be in an RFP. Again, we say, don't reinvent the wheel. If there's a guidance, there's some kind of that you can do, I urge you to go out, look at this, and take a look. We also have 2 resources from our partners agencies at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They have body-worn camera model policies, and they also have a technology policy framework that you can look at, go through the website, either through the toolkit website, or go into IACP. Next slide, please. Now, testing and evaluation. As we talk time and time again, I had mentioned before that I'd spent quite a few years in law enforcement, and this technology we were just starting to use, in-car cameras, video sentencing kind of things. But body-worn cameras weren't really an issue yet. But we've seen this moving forward of where law enforcement technology is today, where it was just 5 years ago, sometimes even a year ago. And, it's not uncommon at all. And we urge you that if you want to test products, that you can talk to the service providers, and a lot of them will let you test their products. Sometimes, as we know, in technology, we may read about things, or we may purchase things without really testing and putting our hands on it. It's almost like doing a test ride in a car. You want to have that feel. You want to see what it does. Does it meet your criteria? So doing this kind of testing is not unforeseen. It is not part of the procurement process, but it's what you're using, and it will help you to justify in the future some of the things on why you may choose a particular service provider in purchasing your cameras as they go through the procurement process. Now, as I said, this is very important when you're making that final decision, and it helps you when you're doing some documentation to us as the program lead. Geraldo mentioned about sole source. If you're a large agency like one of the state agencies, or a large city where you might be doing 500, 600 cameras, that dollar amount is going to be over $250,000. So you may have to do a sole source. Having this information that you've done on your testing and evaluation will assist with that. It's information that we may ask for. So it's very important that you document this, keep that documentation, especially if you receive an award. Also because sometimes we may have a evaluation or an OIG, Office of Investigator General, that might come back and want to do a look of why this was done, how it was done, and so forth. So having this plan and doing the right testing and so forth is very important to your program. Next slide. Now, when you're doing these considerations, when you have to make a decision on what technologies that you may want to consider, I believe if you had the opportunity to listen to our keynote speaker, Chief Ramsey, he talked about some of the very unique things about the type of mounting equipment for the body-worn cameras, how they were doing it. We've had, if you would go back and listen to the podcast just recently that we had on the protest and use of body-worn cameras. The deputy chief from Washington, D.C. had mentioned about that changing the type of uniforms that they wear. We also, for areas that have changing of summer uniforms, the winter uniforms, those things are all things to be taken into consideration. So the mounting location, where it is on your uniform, what the recording process is, when things can turn on, turn off, what's your storage, how are you going to do that? Those are kind of things that all need to be considered. The field, where it is, the tilt, and all the rest of those things, battery life, and some of the add-on features. We have some of the service providers actually have where the body-worn camera may work in conjunction with an in-car camera. So those are things to be considered. The one thing that I would say, and I've learned a lot in working with our subject matter experts over the year, is that you want to take a look, and when you're looking at this technology, have the people involved that are actually going to be using it. Not just having upper administrators, chiefs, but not only the officers that are going to be using it, but also these mid-level managers, because they may have some input. They may know other departments that are using some of this technology. So having that, and even putting together some type of possibly an advisory committee to talk about these kind of things will be very helpful to you, and possibly including your department's union. These will be helpful when it comes to the full procurement process. Now, the price is obviously going to be an issue that you're going to have to deal with. In the federal funds, for those of you that may not know, there is, and for those of you that are grantees, you are familiar with this, but those of you that might be looking to be part of this program, we do have a limitation that you can only ask for $2,000 per camera ordered. So, for example, if you're going to buy 50 cameras, that would be $100,000. Sorry. So that would be the number that you could have. And then your match has to be one-on-one. So that price is very important to know all these different things. The biggest thing that we hear about now are storage options. And I had mentioned on the previous session that how the use of storage from a support standpoint has changed in 2020. So our grantees in 2020 can no longer take storage as a match cost. And this is not something that BJA, but this came from our Office of General Counsel. So in that storage, what you're looking at is how you're going to store it. Are you going to use some kind of server that's local? In some of our previous presentations this week, we did hear from some departments that are doing that storage locally. A lot of them are doing it in a cloud scenario, which is provided by the service provider, and some of them have this hybrid model. We've also talked to some agencies that have talked about going into a cooperation where you might have everybody goes in and they choose to have a server, and they all might use that particular server. So there's a lot of different ways out there to take a look at that. And finally, in this particular consideration is digital media evidence management. We've heard a lot of talk about this, especially over the last few days. What's the audit trail, who has access to it, what kind of analytics are done on it, and how do you redact it, but also the release, who has the authority to release the information, what you can do, who can request copies. So all of these things are extremely important. Next slide, please. This is the matrix that I had mentioned, and this is the one that comes, you'll see at the very bottom there. It's from our NIJ market survey. If you go and look at the slides, this is a hyperlink that you can actually get to the survey. But you'll see it talks about the service provider, what the approximate costs are, the kind of displays, all these things that are that might be of interest and that may help you make that decision. So this is the kind of data, kind of information that you should have to just make sure that you're making the right decision. But also, when you're making that decision, you have a lot of people taking a look at this. It's not just one person making the final decision, but you have this committee, or you have all the people that meet all the things that meet your requirements. Next slide, please. This section gets into a little bit more about the storage considerations. As we started to briefly mention before, how is this secure? What's the encryption, auditing, connectivity, and so forth? These are the kind of things, especially security now, with all the incidents that have been happening, across the country with people hacking into information that might be available. A lot of times I just saw that yesterday that University of Kentucky information about their students that were tested for COVID-19 had no security on it and was actually hacked. So, I mean, at a minimum, you need to, especially with the information that's there, know that there are people out there that are trying to get this information. Next, we talked about, who can access that data, control and ownership. That you as the agency has the ownership of that data, have the authority to provide who has access to it. I know a lot of things that we've heard over the last few days was talking about not only, when can officers view it, can they view it prior to doing the report? When can the prosecutors have access to it? What information can be shared with media and the public and all these other things. So there are so many things, elements that are necessary to this. The other thing is capacity and growth. I did hear some individuals that when we were hearing from the voices from the field, talking about the total number of videos that they have available. So, you know, if you're a department that has 500 cameras, you can only imagine the amount of video that you're talking about, 3 shifts, you know, 24 hours a day, all these kind of things that are extremely important for you to take into consideration. Not only the capacity, but, you know, this is where you are today. Where am I going to be in a year? Where am I going to be in 5 years? Because one of the things that we see, even though this is a 3-year grant process, a lot of the service providers look and want to do a 5-year contract. So that could be difficult in providing the award, that they have that cost in there for a 5-year period when we can only allow you to do it for 3 years. So those are, again, more considerations. So what do you do if your system fails? How do you maintain the system? Who has the responsibility for this? If there is a type of maintenance contract that you might have, that's something that could very easily be used. You could use federal funds for that. You also could use your match grant for that. So your match funding. So those are things, again, to consideration, that not only do you purchase the cameras, you issue the cameras, you have your deployment, the implementation of all your policies and everything, you need to make sure that you maintain it, and what's your policy and procedures when the system fails. Now, we talked about there, especially with the large number of videos that are out there and what's being captured, what is the redundancy that you have on there? So this can also be very costly. So those are all things, again, these are just things that you need to take into consideration when you're procuring this stuff, doing your procurement request for proposal. These are elements that you want and need to have in there. The retention policy. This varies. Some say that we'll keep it for X amount of time, and one of the reasons that some of the information is not retained because of the cost of storage and so forth. But if you're in the middle of a particular type of case, if it's a very high-profile video or situation, that you may need to keep things forever. Now, one of the things that I did hear come up on one of the workshops earlier this week was very similar to police records, forever. Somebody called it the F word, forever. So it's just something that, again, you have to be in there. And then the final element, obviously, cost. The bottom line comes down to how much federal funds can we get, how much do we have to spend, and what we actually can do to, for this. So next slide, please. So this is just a little bit of a table here, and like I said, if you go to the slides for this, I mean, it's a good reference point. The cloud, it talks about, these are the plus and minuses. Limited storage at a cost, obviously, easily expandable, but sometimes are expensive. But, the other thing is that you have this requirement from the security standpoint. You may have great security when it comes to your records management system or how you're doing things initially, where it might not be able to be hacked by an intruder, but you, based on the service provider, are kind of at their mercy. Now, local storage, we always talk about, and a lot of our projects, not only the body-worn camera, but we talk about records management systems, those kind of things, where they like to have local. And this is local control. And nothing's better than having local control of your information. So you have, in a local scenario, you're going to have to buy that server bank. You're going to have to buy that memory and all that stuff to have that. Also that, especially in smaller, middle-sized departments, you may not have an IT person in your police department. And the IT person may be somebody from your municipality. So one of those things that you have to consider is, do they have the proper credentials to be storing and accessing this particular information? So again, some of the things about local. Now, these 2 points, these finally 2 points here, really talk about the value of this local storage. Local control. I've worked on several national information sharing programs, and these are one of the things that people are looking at. If you have it locally, you have data ownership, local control. These are things that are in your favor. So you have to look at those kind of things, but you have to be prepared to the growth. Again, as your department grows, for example, maybe you start out with 50 cameras, and all of a sudden your department, you're adding 10 more officers, or you decide to expand it and include some other individuals, and maybe you only had it for your street officers, but you want to include SWAT, your drug task forces, or even if it's a county department where you also have responsibility for the incarceration. So those might be different deputies or officers dealing with those kind of things. Next slide, please. Now, again, this is another little chart that I think is extremely helpful when you're talking about some of your cost considerations. We already talked in depth about cloud versus local. Vendors and service providers are willing to break out the cost, and they may be unwilling to do this, and because they want to do it as a package deal. This sometimes becomes an issue with the grant process, because we need that. For example, I said they want a 5-year contract, and this grant is only for 36 months. So we can't have that going over into years 4 and 5. So the other thing is, and I know some of the states, and I heard from individuals over the last few days, that there may be data retention laws and policies that would affect, might be local, county, state. Those are all things that you need to be prepared and have that knowledge of. So the other thing is this bullet point number 4 talks about some of the labor costs, what analytics that you want, the process speed, that space and infrastructure upgrades, all very important. So when you're looking at the cost considerations, when you mention acquisition, basically you're talking about the price. Installation. This may include your software, hardware, server, if needed, making those connections to make sure when you're doing that and moving information from that to the storage facilities and so forth. The training is very important. Is that training coming from the service provider? Is it training that might be coming from our training and technical assistance people? All those kind of things, it's very important. I will tell you right now that several cases that I've worked on over the years had to do with failure to train. So, having that proper use training, and what do you do on, and I've heard a lot of this talk about when you can turn the audio on and off, turn the camera on and off. These are all things that will be part of policy, which would be internal training, but also training that you might get outside your agency. So, this maintenance, we just talked about this at great length. The things about these accessories, we hear a lot of departments talking about how long these take. Sometimes, for example, I may have a department of 20 officers, and they may order 25 cameras, and that's what they put in for their grant. Now, this is usually allowable, and we take a look at this because some of them have extra cameras in case one's malfunction, in case they need to charge ones and other ones need to go out. So these, again, things that you take into your consideration. So, having that dependence on this additional energy that you might need for expenditures. Software licenses. Chief Ramsey had mentioned this in his opening statements as part of the keynote, where he talked about how many licenses that you may have. For example, you may have 50 licenses, but when you're in the initial contract, the service provider said, well, here's these extra 10 or these whatever. So you need to make sure that they're not coming back and charging with those. If you have 50 licenses, you need to know that, have that information, and know that information. And again, when you look at this operations and labor, what is the daily cost for this and labors for using the body-worn cameras? This would include the management, who you have looking at this, managing this, and really doing this, and documentation. Documentation is extremely important. Next slide, please. This, as I mentioned this before, this is for our generic request for proposal document. This is the link for it. Again, we said it's a template, a model to assist you during this procurement process. Obviously, things change based on department, size. If you have, one of the unique things we see sometimes is a department that might be contracting services to unincorporated areas. So when you're doing these kind of things, this procurement process may or may not work. As the disclaimer said, this is not definitive. It doesn't replace any other requirements that are out there, whether it's state, federal, local, or again, if you're working community to community. So you need to take a look at these kind of things. But this is, again, I'll echo it again about not reinventing the wheel. So next slide, please. This next section here, and we'll be getting into questions and answers here shortly, but the competitive sealed bidding. This is the kind of things, and this kind of gives you 4 points to take into consideration when you're using competitive sealed bids. Now, you really would like it to be described and very clear cut on, what will be awarded, what the minimum requirement, the response is, the responsibilities of the bidder, and what you plan to accomplish in the contract. The other thing is too is sometimes when we do contracts, because we're not a lot of times public safety agencies only have limited number of contracts, not like everyday public businesses. That sometimes there's things that we may not look at or we oversee. So these are the kind of things that you want to make sure that your solicitor takes a look at, that you have other people kind of look at this, and maybe other people that have worked with you in this particular project. When it talks about the number of contractors, you may get 2 or more, but again, you want to make sure that it's written so it is not so limited that only one individual can come in. Now, you want to make sure that a lot of times because we work on a very tight timeline sometimes, so you have to make sure that when you're doing this and putting things in place, that there's appropriate time available to not only put out the request for proposal or the bidding, but also when it's open, when it's closed, and the responsibility of what's going to be on there. In other words, if you're accepting the lowest bidder or the one that more clearly meets what your request for. So sometimes you may get the lowest bidder, but doesn't meet the requirements that are in there. So those are things that you have to make very clear. So there is no, and this last one is important, that there's no requirement to hold negotiations and discussions, as part of the competitive process or as part of this procurement. Next slide, please. Okay. We're ready, Geraldo and myself are ready to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Great. Thank you, David and Gerardo, for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions. So the first one is, during a test and evaluation part of a request for proposal process, what is a good way to document feedback from hardware and back-end users effectively?
I'll take that one, Geraldo. One of the things is, as you're doing that testing, whoever's using that particular product, they need on a daily basis, did the battery life last and all those kind of things. They just need to document that. You can literally do that in a kind of an Excel spreadsheet or kind of on a daily process. But what they need to do is not only identify the things that they may not like about it, but the things that they thought were a benefit for them. It's also important for if you have multiple users to compare that information, because you may have one unit that worked better than another from the same company. It might have been a battery issue or things like that. So that documentation can be done in a kind of a Excel spreadsheet on a daily basis, or you can do it weekly or however it is, but that documentation can be very important on their final decision.
Great, thank you. And the TTA team does have a couple examples of kind of like a survey form that some agencies have used to provide to the officers testing the cameras in the IT departments. And what you put on that survey form is going to be specific to, you know, what your requirements are for a camera, and that differs between agencies. But we can certainly provide those if anyone's interested. Just feel free to email bwctta@cna.org. Okay, next question. Wanted to make sure they understood the requirement for using match funding for storage for 2019 versus 2020 grantees. So could you just reiterate what you'd said about that?
Yeah, that under 2019, it does allow for agencies to use their match funds for storage, but it does not allow them to use match funds in 2020. So that, again, is a decision that came from our Office of General Counsel. There is a one caveat. It's a bit of a change to that. If it was a software as a service package where the information was not broken out, that's something that would have to be discussed. But our Office of General Counsel made it very clear that the straight up match funding cannot be used for storage in 2020.
Great, thank you. So most of our grantees on now are probably, you know, in that 2019 realm where it's still okay. But if anyone applied for an expansion grant, or if you know any partners that applied in 2020, then, you know, your requirements will change, and it's good to know about that change that's coming. Probably going to love this follow-up question to that. Do you have any idea why that change was made and why storage costs aren't allowed moving forward when it is one of the larger expenses? And I think this actually has to do with a federal level requirement, not even a Department of Justice thing, but I'll go ahead and see if you have an answer for that one.
Well, I actually do. It's something that we went back and forth on, but again, every year, the solicitations that go out are reviewed from our Office of General Counsel. There was a little bit change in guidance, a little more clearance that was provided by Congress, and the Office of General Counsel, even though that it might have been questionable in the previous years, this new update made it very clear from the Congress, because the funds are issued by Congress, and that makes it. They made it very clear, and we had a ruling on that, and that brought the change. I mean, it was BJA did everything we could to even reaching out and say, well, this is what our grantees have been used to. This is because of the cost, but it's very difficult because the funds do come from Congress, and they're not internal Department of Justice funds.
Great, thank you for that clarification explanation. Another question, could you restate the $2,000 threshold, and is that per officer, per camera? How exactly does that work?
Yes, the $2,000 number is per camera requested. For again, let's say, I only asked for 5 cameras, that would be $10,000. So that then you would be responsible to provide a $10,000 match. So again, it's 1 for 1, dollar to dollar. It's not by number of officers. It's by the number of cameras that you request. I had mentioned briefly about, say you have 20 officers and you ask for 25 cameras. You can ask for a few extra cameras. Again, we do realize that, issues arrive or problems. or when it comes to charging them and so forth. But for example, if you had 50 officers and you wanted 40 extra cameras to have that, that wouldn't be acceptable. It's got to be within reason.
Great, thank you. We have another question about checklists. Is there a grant checklist agencies can follow to keep and help them maintain their BJA grant?
I would go by the checklist on the solicitation.
Great.
Body-worn camera solicitation.
Very good. Yes, the solicitations are quite detailed in terms of what needs to be followed and once. That's a very good point, that's a good resource for that. Thank you, Herta. Okay, so if you can, the question is that you cannot go over the $2,000 per body-worn camera limit. Does that include license doc fee cost?
Yes, includes everything. That's the actual total cost. So whatever your is involved with that has to be included. Again, if you, for example, if this number is takes you over the $2,000 per camera, you can use that as your match. But the federal funds, that's maximum that you can make a request for based on the number of cameras that you've requested.
Great, thank you, Mr. Lewis. Yeah, so, you know, there are some agencies wanting to do a lot with their body-worn cameras. So, you know, with automatic triggers, with integration with in-car cameras, you know, a lot of peripheral things that they might be interested in. That all can be covered under their own grant, under their own funding, right? So long as the body-worn camera and its access and its peripherals that are being asked for to be paid for through the grant don't go over $2,000. That's correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And you kind of mentioned kind of an interesting thing, and I'm surprised it didn't come up as a question here, is some have asked about can this, even though it talks about body-worn cameras, can this be used for in-car cameras? We have attempted and submitted requests to expand this to other types of video enhancements, types of things, but Congress has come back and said that this will remain, at this point, specifically for body-worn cameras.
Very good, thank you. We have another question about the $2,000. Is that the federal funds total and does not include the matching? So is it $2,000 per camera between federal and match, or is it $2,000 federal and then another $2,000 match?
Yes, let's use the example of you want 5 cameras, so that you would be allowed to request $10,000 in federal funds. Then your requirement as a grantee would to provide $10,000 in matching funds, 1-to-1. So your actual the actual budget for your program would be $20,000.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Here's one more. Can this $2,000 cost be budgeted out throughout the cost of the grant, say, for example, over the 36-month period covered by the grant? Or does it have to be spent as one fell swoop?
No, it's that's a requirement that you're going to tell us that $2,000 per camera amount helps you determine the program budget and would be over 36 months. So you would say, I'm going to do this in year 1, I'm going to do this in year 2, I'm going to do this in year 3. Now, we did have some questions in our previous session that what happens if, you know, I exhaust my funds in year 2? Well, then, you know, that's fine. You just do an early closeout to your award. But what we like to see is taking your number, and again, I used an example of 5 cameras was $10,000. $10,000 with a $20,000 total budget. But think about large agencies where they're getting 200-300 cameras. So they may look at getting, you know, 150 cameras in year 1, 150 cameras in year 2. So those are all things that can be broken down, but it has to be documented in the budget.
Very good, thank you. Thank you all for your participation in this session. I hope it was informative and enlightening. Certainly seems to have been so. So thank you, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Velasquez, for your time and all the knowledge you impart on us.